The last time Art and I were in conversation at an event hosted by the 92nd Street Y was in 2011, so over a decade ago.
Yes,
and
BCE, before the COVID era.
Right. And as I note in my introduction to the book, Mouse Now, this is also an event in which Art got up in the middle and went to go smoke a cigarette, leaving me alone on this stage. So hopefully that won't happen tonight.
I hope so. I got my cigarette with me.
But I meant to ask you, what has changed in your thinking about Mouse since 2011, when we last did a public event at the Y?
That was in the who was president then? Was that was that was that Barack Obama years or
Yes.
before? Oh, okay. So that's changed.
In your thinking about Mouse?
Absolutely. I mean, the
Say
world
more.
we're living in now feels sort of like very foreboding. The country's much more overtly split in factions. There's no real commonality of shared reality and all that stuff. So it makes it much more fraught to talk about a book about fascism in the present rather than it did to talk about it as clearly in the past and in the wings always in America, but more overtly now than ever before for me. Oh, I'm sorry. I should project. I am proud to tell you that I don't have COVID. I just have a cold. I found it out in the subway coming up here when the PCR test came back. But as a result, my throat's a little scratchy. But I'll try to make sure you can hear my rantings.
Okay, so can I ask a follow-up to
Sure.
that? So one of the things you and I have spoken about is that you have started to feel more comfortable recently talking about Mouse as an explicitly Jewish book. Do I have that right?
In part, it's also just, basically it's something else. It includes that. But there used to be a time after Mouse was finished that all I could draw was pictures of 500-pound mice chasing me. And all I was trying to do was either evade it or compete with it. And in the past year especially, I've had to just accept that I was embraced by it, swallowed by it, and became a damn 500-pound mouse. It's my job now. And I used to want anything but that. As I said in an acceptance speech for a Lifetime Achievement Award a week or so ago, I can't remember.
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago from the National Book Foundation, I never wanted to be the Elie Wiesel of comic books.
So what happened?
Well, we needed somebody to point out, never again, okay? Maybe it's better not to have this happen again. So without wanting to go whole hog into this as a career, I've been swept up into it through the back door of the book bannings that are part and parcel of the current fraught moment. But it's not like I wanted that to be my job, and I don't have any, I guess the word Jewish isn't a problem, it's like an adjective, right? But I never thought of myself as having to be a representative of Jewish people, and I used to be kind of annoyed that this book that I'd spent all these years on weaving a lot of different themes through it, clearly about generations and the Holocaust and all that stuff, although I'll use the word Holocaust the way I'll use the word graphic novel.
In quotation marks.
Under total protest. I don't like either phrase. That Elie Wiesel, who I don't want to become, his word Holocaust, and it means burnt offering, and that seems like the wrong approach when a perfectly good word, genocide, was invented for World War II. Graphic novels, because hell, my book, which is one of the most lauded graphic novels, isn't fiction. Graphic can mean pornographic. It doesn't do anything to evade the problems. So, lo and behold, it's my destiny to be the the graphic novelist of the Holocaust.
And maybe you've already answered this, but what are your have your feelings about that changed in the past 10 years?
About what?
About being what you just said, the graphic novelist of the Holocaust.
Well, I'd like to think of it as the graphic novel that was one of the first to demo what that medium is capable of. I actually had two ideas, and I fortunately was, circumstances made it be Mouse, because I'd moved back to New York while I was still nominally editing an underground comics magazine called Arcade, looking around for what I would do next. And I was planning to do a book called The Life in Ink that would be a fictional cartoonist who was born in 1880 and lived to 1980. So from the beginning of comics through him being a 100-year-old man still somehow working on underground comics, all made with artifacts. So there'd be little booklets that he had made, his diary, and we'd print it on our printing press. Francoise is here somewhere, I imagine. Yes, she is. I was right. It wasn't just imaginings. Had a printing press, and I was going to do these as little booklets and have it in a box, and that was my project. But then I also had this thing I hadn't counted on, which is now that I'd moved back from New York to escape the pressures of being the bad cop of Arcade with Bill Griffith, my co-editor. I could be the bad cop from 3,000 miles away, rejecting things and whatever. But it meant I was in New York, and New York is where Vladek lived, and I could only, for so many weeks or months, pretend that I was still in California.
Did you put a sock on the phone? Something like that?
It's a towel. I read it.
A towel.
Yeah.
Good trick.
In the Dick Tracy Crime Stoppers textbook, in the upper right-hand corner, where they'd have different hints, they could say that if you they said that if you can put a towel over the receiver of a phone, it's much harder in our contemporary world where the towel would just get the phone lost forever somewhere in its folds. But in the old days, when there were real receivers, it would make you sound like you were talking from a long distance. So for a while, I was just pretending I was in California. And then when I realized I was going to have to see him, that led to having regular meetings, but coming equipped with a tape recorder and notebook. And I mean, at the time, I was really nervous about it because we didn't get along well.
Oh.
Was it?
Can everybody hear us both much better now? Were you struggling to hear before?
Oh, I wasn't
I'm so
clear.
sorry. I didn't realize.
Something happened.
Something happened. Thank you.
To quote that great
team.
Joseph Heller novel. Okay, so
Towel over
the
phone.
receiver so that you could pretend to be talking from San Francisco and not tell your father that you were only like a 35-minute subway ride away. And then when I had to face up to that, I went figuring, okay, I'll start. I'd been thinking about doing something about Mao's, more than this 3-page comic strip that you probably have on that circle of slides. And knew that it was more than just a 3-page story. So I began going out to see him, and that became all-consuming. The other project never happened, and I'm better off. That would have just been, Spiegelman, that postmodernist from 1987, you know. This was more complex, more challenging. And I did go out with the idea that the microphone was a little bit like a crucifix for a vampire. It was a way of keeping my father at bay until I figured out how to deal with all this stuff, and it ended up being a very rewarding thing actually for both of us, and led to that book eventually.
That's so interesting, and it reminds me of something I think you've said to me before, which was that doing that book and interviewing him was like a way to have a relationship with him.
It was my relationship.
Like it was the site of your relationship.
Yeah. Sorry. Basically, I didn't go out without the tape recorder.
Yeah.
But eventually it just became more natural for that to be part of the thing. But it wasn't like let's get together and go watch a football game or something. That was neither of us could have made it through a football game. But anything that would be the normal father-son stuff wasn't easy to get to. So most of it was the kind of things that formed the cement between his memories that made the book flow back and forth in time.
Mm-hmm. I want to skip ahead quickly to this page, which is from the prologue of Mouse. And you've talked about this prologue and this exchange with your father and this beginning of the book as being a kind of fractal of the whole book. Can you explain that?
Yeah, basically, I wanted to have something to set it up rather than just coming as grown up with the tape recorder. So this was a memory from our Rego Park life after I think we'd first lived in Norristown, Pennsylvania with my mother's brother and wife, and then Coney Island, and then up in Fort Tryon Park, and eventually his own very small 2-family house in Rego Park. And there I had a circle of friends in the neighborhood, and we were going, well, most of you have read the book, but basically that thing of just a normal kid thing, like, which I found in looking at the essays by foreigners, they'd never heard the phrase rotten egg. Like, the whole thing was we were racing each other, and I twisted my ankle or something, and they were saying, last one to the finish line is a rotten egg. So they read a lot into that rotten egg.
Just to clarify, you're talking about people who contributed to the Mouse Now book.
Yes.
Okay.
So two of the essays referred to this thing, thinking of it as an egg that had been fertilized, but badly. That's me. And basically, so they made a lot of that, but basically it was trying to represent how my attempt to be a kid in America with other kids was squelched in a way when I came back to find my father, and I was sniffling because they had run away without me, called me a rotten egg. And as my father has as the last word in that two-page prologue, friends, they lock them in a room without food for 2 weeks and you'll see what it is, friends. So all of a sudden, the whole shadow of the rest of the 2 volumes sits on a minor incident that was just hanging out at home. And I don't know if you want me to go into that essay that we started talking about or do that later, but...
I don't know which essay you're
talking
about.
The one by the Frenchman.
Sure.
Okay.
So,
I'm
maybe
reading
could I just pause you for one moment and just go back to the covers of the book just to make everything clear. So this book has obviously been published and simultaneously in French, but there's an essay in the English version that's translated from the French that Art's been really interested in, just for context.
Yeah, it's unusual. I mean, I don't read a lot of this stuff, especially because I would say 40%, 50% are a kind of academic language style. Is that right?
I meant it to be a mix of public writing and academic writing.
So there was some I'd already read because they appeared in magazines I would read otherwise. And then there's somewhere it was like, oh shit, my Mises, what does that mean again? Okay. And it took so they were harder to assimilate, but I was trying to read, I was curious about the foreign ones, that was really interesting to me. And there's one essay by a man named...
Pierre Albin Delanoy.
Yeah, so I read this essay because the title was something like Spiegelman in Nowhere's Land?
Nobody's Land.
In Nobody's Land.
Can I pause you for one moment just to explain? Because I'm sure a lot of you have read Mouse, but I'm sure few of you have already read Mouse Now. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted the book to have was a kind of global reach in terms of which essays I included. So I'm very proud that we have essays in French, German, and Hebrew that were translated into English for the first time for Mouse Now. So that's a little bit of the context when Art is talking about foreign essays.
Yeah, and then so I'm looking through some of them, and it's interesting because it's also set up more or less developmentally from the first essay that appeared in what, like 1986 or 7?
85 is Ken Tucker's
before
piece.
The book was published, and had a big impact on the way Mouse was received in the world. And then there were other essays clustered together, like in 3 different sections, and near the end, I guess, there's this one essay that kind of blew me away. I only read about half of them so far. The Mises essay remains unread, but it's readable. I just found an essay that was called Spiegelman in Nobody's Land.
Can I pause you for one more moment? This is maybe the last time, so I'll interrupt you. Okay, so just to be clear, I also mentioned this in the introduction, but Art had no editorial role, as I think is already obvious, in the essays I selected for the book.
In fact, I kept asking her to publish some negative articles.
Yes, he was begging me to publish negative essays. And I have to say there aren't that many. And I said if I thought that they lived up to my standards for an excellent essay, I would consider them. So anyway, he was begging me to publish negative essays about Mouse.
Just to keep it more mixed up. So I thought she had actually put one in because Spiegelman in Nobody's Land?
Nobody's Land.
Nobody's Land. I didn't think was going to be an essay lauding me. But what it was really interesting to me because it was like an Occam's razor through the book. It wasn't an especially long essay. It starts... It reminds me, I'm sorry to be circumlocucious here, but
no, I'm having fun.
It reminds me of when I was a freshman in college, we had to read the Odyssey. And the paper we had to write at the end of the semester was to pick one character who's not Odysseus and follow that character through the book and see how that character changed, didn't change, interacted with Odysseus, and maybe reflected themes in the book. I had no patience for this, although I loved reading the book. But as a result, I found what I call an Occam's razor through. I took a character named Argo. He's the dog. So he appears at the beginning faithfully and wistfully watching Odysseus go out to sea, and then waits for him patiently for whatever that was, 20, 30 years. And then he's there when Odysseus comes back, the most faithful person in all of Greece. I actually managed to spin 1,000 words out of that somehow. Because even Penelope, was that her name? Yeah. Penelope was accused of being unfaithful for a while. Nobody accused the dog of anything. So that was a way to get through the whole book, tie it together the way they asked me to. And this guy did something almost the same, except much more intelligent. I got a P.
For pass?
Yeah, everybody else got A through F, and he gave me a P and said, if you write another paper like this, you get an F. So it was fair. It was a fair criticism. Anyway, this essay was really amazing to me because he followed one little strand, which was my phantom brother, Rishu, who died at about 3, being poisoned by his aunt, where he'd been sent to be in hiding when they knew they were going to be taken to Auschwitz and knew what that implied at the time. She poisoned herself, her kids, and Rishu, and another kid that was from our family that was staying there because they'd be better protected there. So, in a sense, if the book really is, if the prologue to the book is a fractal, that fractal includes the idea that there's no room for me to be a kid, right? Like I come in wanting to be comforted for having sprained my ankle, and there's no room for that because friends will show you what it is, friends, if you leave them in a room without food. He had so many heavier things to think about. This wasn't a place for comforting. If anything, he just wanted me to hold the piece of wood he was sawing. And so that's mentioned as one of the first sightings of Argo, of that thing. And then it moves pretty quickly to include, of the several photographs in the book, there's only 3, and they come up in a number of the essays, most notably from your long essay by a mentor of yours, Marion Hirsch. That was a really good essay, even if it doesn't have a lot of academic jargon in it, but she did invent a word, which was post-memory, meaning memories that you didn't have. I assume that's like epigenetics, that it's a way of having to live through the trauma to understand what happened. So the next time, what's his name, Jerome?
Pierre Albin, Illinois.
Albin. Yeah, so Pierre comes back into the story with this one photograph that's floating free. The other 2 photographs are embedded in panels. There are photographs that are drawn from photographs, but there's only 3 actual photographs. And there's one photograph of Rishu, the brother, who's just floating at the dedication part of the 2nd volume, just in a blank page, and it just says, for Rishu and for my children. And that photo, he says, is floating free, so it floats through the entire work at the beginning of the 2nd volume. And then somewhere from there, he weaves together the little bits of information you've gotten about Rishu, most specifically the fact that when I was growing up, there was that photo that I show that had been a small, almost passport-sized photo blown up to be a very fuzzy, almost abstract photograph that stared balefully down at me every time I went into my parents' bedroom over the dresser. And that was the phantom brother who I had sibling rivalry with and couldn't quite match up to because he was a baby. He didn't do anything especially wrong. Me, I was trouble. And so that's the 2nd part of the story that he's telling. And then the 3rd is on the very last page where you have, that was hard won because this was a 13-year-long project. And the last chapter, I was stumped. I went through, out of the 13 years, I was stumped twice. Once when starting the 2nd volume. That lasted, I think, 8 months before Francoise got me to a shrink. And we changed course a little bit, and I found somebody who could help me into it. But the very last chapter was really problems again. I had all these different alternate endings that weren't especially good. And then somewhere in Paris Review, although I've never been able to find it since.
I've looked too, and I haven't been able to find it.
But I know
sure
it must
it's
be there.
Yeah.
It was in a collection of the essays of the collections of interviews. Somebody says, well, the thing about a last chapter is it has to double in density every page until you get to the last page where every paragraph has to double in density. And then when you get to the last paragraph, it has to double in density for each sentence. And that seemed like something worth thinking about, that the book would be anchored by its ending. And so for me, that involved having 3 endings. The first ending was the fairy tale ending, where my father was kind of consciously wrapping up his memories and narrative, and we lived happy, happy ever after, which it's a nice sentiment, but it wasn't so much what had happened to them. And then followed by my father then saying something like, you can probably read it easier than me, but let's stop, please, your tape recorder. I'm tired from talking Rishu, and it's enough stories for now. So he called me by Rishu's name, indicating that there was really no place for me. Like I hadn't fully gotten born because there's this palimpsest of this other person. And then without thinking about it too much, I knew that the whole thing had to rest on a tombstone. That this was essentially a 13-year-long yahrzeit candle I'd created. And so after this tombstone, which has my mother's birth and death dates on one side, my father's on the other, there's something that's not really the typical way of ending a book, but my signature large on that last page with the date that I started working on Mao's and the date that I finished. And that's the no place land that I was in. And that kind of blew me away. So when I read this essay, where he cuts through the whole book just to deal with Rishu and how that kept me from getting born in a certain sense, it helped me on what was your first question about, like, so how do you feel about Mao's Now being a Jewish book, blah, 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 blah. Because basically, I had to acknowledge that in some weird way, Mao's had taken the vacuum of my life and placed it in those 13 years. So the date that I started the book, which was, I think, 78. Right?
78.
78 was the beginning of my coming out of the womb and beginning to work on this project that I was supposed to work on. And then the death date, the date of finishing the book, which was 1991. Thank you. 1991 was the 13 years of my life, the bar mitzvah of my life, and also the 13 years of it. So I knew all that. It's not like, oh, I'm telling you something that's surprising to you, but to get to myself. But it was something that was a very intense realization that I'd lived the rest of my life after Mao's living with that notion that I really did get born and die with Mao's. I could never escape that 500-pound mouse afterwards. I tried doing sexy stuff. I tried doing New Yorker covers that like raised scandalous issues for a number of years. I tried making a book about September 11th, and they all have their value. I'm glad I made them. But they do feel like they're all, in one way or another, in call and response to Mao's. And interestingly enough, right now, I'm living through the new iteration of Breakdowns, which was the work that immediately preceded Mao's. Like, if I started this in 78, 77 was the supposed publication date of the first Breakdowns. It came out again in 2008, and now finally is out as a paperback version of itself as the early work. It's not all my early work. I was doing stuff professionally from about 1964 or so when I was a kid, 16 years old. But the better stuff, when I found out how to be an underground cartoonist without being exactly dogging Robert Crumb and S. Clay Wilson's pervert pirate footsteps, but found someplace else to stand, was the beginning of my own work, finding certain things I could do. And that includes that 3-page Mao's that I did in 72.
Yeah, and it also includes Prisoner on the Hell Planet, another strip you drew in 1972 that then becomes embedded in Mao's. So
right.
I was wondering if you could describe the 3-page Mao's for people who might not have encountered that.
Well, it's 3 pages. It was one anecdote, mostly stuff I just vaguely remembered, because my father was not very forthcoming with this information. I was surprised how forthcoming he was once I was an adult. But it was done for a comic book called Funny Aminals, with a Robert Crumb cover that had this big-legged, big-breasted, and big-butted chicken lady being chased by 2 small foxes, and they bring her up to their house, and then they eat her, because, hey, they're foxes, she's a chicken. So it wasn't sexually eating her, it was just, that's how chickens and foxes hang. And so that was a lot of the material went in different places. The only requirement for that book was to use anthropomorphic characters. And that ultimately is what I kept wanting to find a way into, because I thought it was a big deal to be in a book that Robert Crumb had done the cover of. We were friends, but usually he was hanging out on Park Avenue and I was down in the Lower East Side or something in terms of renown as a cartoonist. And basically, I didn't quite know where to go. For a while I was going to do a horror comic book story, like the EC horror comics that would have twist endings about a guy trying to get ready for work and he's a mouse but looks rather human, square-jawed mouse. And then when he finally is ready to go outside, he runs into a mousetrap that's gigantic and it kills and mangles him, like the snap ending, so to speak, of the story. And I realized that was a really long haul for a very short slide in a sense, so I was still stuck. Then...
but you also had like mice on the brain, it seems like.
Well, yeah. I figured I would use cats and mice and dogs as the animals of choice without knowing why, but that's what I grew up with as the basic funny animal comics. I could have used ducks, I suppose.
Or pigs.
But what really made it interesting to me was, while still scrambling, I was sitting in on my friend Ken Jacobs' film lectures in Binghamton, New York. I was no longer a student, but just auditing or hanging out. And one day I come in, he was an independent filmmaker dealing with maybe abstract expressionist films sometimes, things that looked like home movies, things that were inspired by his own studies with Hans Hoffman. And he was teaching movies like The Wizard of Oz, and showing that it's about Dorothy's first menstruation, that's what the red slippers are about, things like that, that took away everybody's childhood illusions, because that was a film everybody saw every year before streaming. And the result was that a lot of people left his class angry and were in tears. But I was finding it a fascinating class, like Ken's a brilliant man, still is. And at some point he says, oh, today we're going to look at some old cartoons. And he's showing these 20s and 30s animated cartoons by Disney and by the Fleischer Brothers. And he has a very early sound film of Mickey Mouse. And Mickey Mouse was different than he became later. He was like, in the 50s, he was just this square suburban mouse. And by the time many of you were born, he was just a corporate logo. I mean, he was nothing else. But in the beginning, he was a jazz-age mouse. And then Ken had also shown some genuinely racist cartoons, like the minstrel-lipped, jazz-age, black-faced, white-lipped things, and says, so what's the difference between these characters and Mickey Mouse? He's just like Al Jolson with big round ears on top of his head. And that was a eureka moment, because I did have mice on the brain. I just didn't realize that it had any way out of the funny animal metaphor. And so at first I went out really excited. I thought I would do a comic strip about mice, blacks in America, and the Ku Klux Cats, and find a way to deal with the issues through a funny animal metaphor in a short story. And that was fun for about 2 days, and then I realized, okay, there were underground comics, I'd been making them already, and I had also done things that were more typical of what Robert Crumb did and some other cartoonists in that world, of using racist stereotypes, ideally to detox them. So you would show the worst cartoon version of any othered minority, and it was there to make you get used to it and not feel the pain of it. It's a little bit like when Lenny Bruce was saying, okay, who's in the audience? I don't think I can even quote that anymore. 1 N-word, 3 S's, and saying, and he says, do you know why I'm saying that? It's so some little black kid won't wake up in tears in the middle of the night. That was I think, one of the nobler parts of it, as opposed to just relishing the cartoon tradition that has been one of the more racist languages one could work in. So from that, I realized I couldn't quite do this without it seeming like one more version of that. And I didn't want to do that. I realized I knew, as I said in a strip about that moment, I knew bupkis about being black in America. I had a couple of black friends, but not as intimate as they could be. And so I didn't feel I was able to do it. And then fortunately for me, there's a story that Kafka wrote, and Kafka was really important to me. I discovered it when I was 12 years old and wasn't allowed in the adult part of the library. But to me, he was like an early screenwriter for The Twilight Zone or something. Mm-hmm. And there's a story called Josephine, the Singer, or the Mousefolk. And it was about the laments of the Jewish people. And as soon as I had mice and Jews, then a lot came into my brain that had to do with Jews as vermin in Nazi Germany. They were seen as that in the propaganda, often as rats. And that allowed a whole thing to happen that became a 3-page version of Maus, the Mouse, I would call it. And it was there specifically just to set the stage for something and do an anecdote that I only partially knew. Mm-hmm. And it was bigger than I knew because I hadn't been seeing my father much. I came from Binghamton, New York, down with this half-finished strip, showed it to him, and he told me the rest of the anecdote, and I had to redo some of it to include that anecdote, but it made a much better 3-page comic. I didn't have the sophistication I had when I came back to it again years later, so it looked much more like cute and blobby and funny animal-like than the later, more austere drawing. But I could talk about this for 10 hours,
Well, can I just pause? I mean, there's so much
please.
to say. Can I pause you for a moment? I've always been so fascinated that the first panel is this drawing of a photograph in the 3-page Maus. It has photo corners, so it's like an artifact.
From my family album, yeah.
Yeah, could you talk more about how you decided to open with that?
Well, I didn't know that much about the Holocaust, and I just knew the put him in a room with no food for a week, and you'll see what it is, friends. And small anecdotes from my mother that were like nightmarishly without context.
Yep.
So I would sneak into the back room and found eventually a book called The Black Book of Polish Jews and was beginning to look at it. So photographs were in these history books that they had, and some very small, Samizdat published things in Poland after the war in Yiddish, but they'd have a few photos. So that was one of the photos that I had as an image of what the hell was it that my parents were living through. So it seemed natural to strive for some kind of document that could set it up properly, and that I projected my father into that photo that was actually, I think, a photo of Buchenwald, maybe, was a way of starting.
Yes, by Margaret Bork-White. And Mariana Hirsch writes really interestingly about that reference. So it was first published in Life, that picture. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was finding some kind of anchor to work with and then turning it into what I was comfortable with was hearing childhood stories at night. So it became the site of what I returned to when I finally moved back to New York and was revisiting this whole thing.
Well, speaking of photographs and also speaking of other early work that's connected to Maus that's in your forthcoming reissue of Breakdowns, could you describe Prisoner on the Hell Planet for people?
Okay.
It's the same year as the 3-page Maus. You drew it, so obviously something very important was going on for you in the early 70s.
I was working on I was out in San Francisco by that time. Maus was started in Binghamton, New York, and I may have done some finishing up work in San Francisco, but I was moving out because it was the call of the wild. This was Paris in the 1920s. It was an art scene that I really needed and wanted to be part of. I had met Crumb already on a previous trip out there when I'd read the issue of Time magazine that had go to San Francisco and wear some flowers in your hair. So I got the flowers, I got a van, drove out there. And I met him not because he was an underground cartoonist, because he had worked at the same bubblegum company I had worked in, so we had something in common. But for me, it was like I was in San Francisco working on underground comics. I was doing an exceptionally bad thing that I tried drawing 3 times and it never came out any better than the first time, which was a thing called a piece of shit, literally. A piece of shit. And it was like, if you ever saw...
The actual title of the piece was that.
If you ever saw One Froggy Day, it's yeah, you know how there's this little frog that sings and nobody recognizes that he can sing opera? So I had a turd that could do the same thing. And I kept trying to make it work as an underground comic story. It got published, then I redrew it for a Spanish magazine. It never was any good. But when I was in the middle of it for the first time, I abandoned it because I was just arguing with my then girlfriend, Michelle, about nothing. And I went away angry and sheepish from our argument back to my drawing table and had one of these kind of Freudian moments of, you're not angry at your girlfriend, it's your mother who killed herself. Good, you're right. But all of a sudden, all of those memories came flooding back in. I didn't have them in the front of my head. If somebody asked, I could say, yes, my mother killed herself, beep. But there's no picture underneath it, no much of anything. And then it really came flooding back because I was ready to hear it. This was 1972. She killed herself 4 years earlier. And at that point, I just started writing down everything that happened, stopped everything else to try to visualize what would that be like as a comic strip, and did it, as I often did, everything was in a different style, and this was more congenial than trying to draw one froggy day with a turd. It was at the time where I was just first beginning to look at things that weren't comics, so German Expressionist art was an easy entry into looking at museum art and became useful for the pain that had to get expressed.
So one of the themes that several of the contributors in Mouse Now return to is the way that you use photography and what you choose to draw versus the few instances in which you reproduce actual photographs in Mouse. Now this entire strip, Prisoner on the Hell Planet, is embedded in Mouse. Can you tell us about this photograph of you and your mother?
Sure. It was just a childhood photo of me in summer camp, and my mother was very, very small. She was like 5'1" or something, you know. And so I was a little bit smaller than her still in 1958 when I was 10 years old, but shooting up. So I think of it as a photo of her keeping me from growing up, you know, keep that plant down there. But it was also a friendly photo, and it was a moment before the full war tragedy of 4 years earlier had happened. So it was useful for setting up context of who are these people. And at first I wasn't going to use this strip at all in Mouse. It was a separate project. And then I realized I'm making a kind of deposition. So it was really necessary to explain what happened to my mother as part of this story. So I could either just have it set in the present, talking about my mother, like in the frame story of the Mouse 2 volumes, talking about the earlier moment when that happened. And that didn't seem like, we'd never even done that in a useful way, my father and I.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. And the other thing was to try to redraw it with scratchboard mice, which seemed idiotic. And finally, it became obvious that it should just be entered into the deposition, and it did a lot of work. For one thing, it indicated that there were other ways I could have drawn Mouse, so that it was a conscious choice. Here was yet one of my styles that was nothing like that. And it used humans instead of mice, and it was much more overheated than the Mouse section, where I didn't experience the past events as viscerally as this past events. So it did a lot of work for me. And it did one thing that was great, which is like, I'm coming out and I just find out to visit the Queen's apartment house, the little building that he was in. And he's in the garage. Mala, my stepmother, tells me he's down there. He's out of sorts. He had just seen this comic strip I had done that I never expected him to see, that was an underground comic with not much circulation, because a friend of Mala's son was into underground comics, showed it to his mother, who showed it to Mala, who showed it to my father. I never thought that chain would happen. But what was interesting to me is there's something about nonfiction comics that's great if you can keep your eye on the ball, which is when I'm talking to him, he says, he's upset, but he says, well, it's good you got it out from your system, or something like that. And I tell you, I'd never have given him that breadth of understanding based on...
Like you wouldn't have given him the credit if you're making it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't have thought of it, because I wouldn't have thought of that as a response within his range. It's as if... But it's like when you meet somebody and you say, you're not yourself today. Yeah, so who am I? J. Edgar Hoover? You know, it's... So selves are big, and using the nonfiction things well was an asset. Sorry. Could you ask a long question?
Sure. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll open it out to questions from the audience. But I want to skip actually to a notebook page of yours from 2007.
Oh.
And you wrote, "Make boxes, fill them, cartoonists and undertakers, same business." So does this have anything to do with Mouse, what you feel like you were doing in Mouse?
Yeah, and comics in general. You're capturing something that's now past, usually, and orchestrating it through time, and it just is what it is. I mean, I was making it up as I was going along, kind of.
Right, it's
But
a
the one thing I
sketchbook
wanted to
page.
point out before we leave breakdowns aside, because
Okay.
I'm really excited that it's out again. It's my pre-uterine life. It's what I was doing before I came on the planet to do Mouse, right? And it's important to that work in that I just discovered art as opposed to the art I understood, which was on newsprint. And Picasso became important to me, Cubism, modernism, the entire panoply of that was something I could now look at. And as a result, the things I thought could be in comics were a little bit more ambitious than they had been. And so Breakdowns is that ambitious work in service of the formal properties of comics. Because one thing about modernism in general is it's about paint. So the equivalent of that is it's about ink. And it's ink in boxes. And there's certain sign systems that you can use to make past, present, and future meld together, to have things that don't feel like they're connected, where the words are just what's in the picture. Like when I was growing up, in some of the comic books I like would say like, Arg from the planet Xeno attacks Martin with his ray gun. And then the picture would be Arg from the planet Xeno with a ray gun attacking. This wasn't the most sophisticated way of doing comics, but it's the way a lot of them were in the 1950s. So here, by separating the words in pictures and making you look around for what the words really referred to in the pictures and stuff, you were forced to really move through a page very differently than you would, and that became very exciting to me. And it remained exciting when I put the best of what I had done in those few years from about 1972 to 1975 or 6 into Breakdowns. And as I feared, nobody but me cared about this book coming out. You know, like it was not in any format that anybody understood. It was an oversized album format. And it wasn't what people were looking for in their underground comics that were around them. And I thought that this was a way of showing a new path, a way things could be. And I realized that if I kept going in that direction that Breakdowns implied, I'd either have to start like hanging out at cocktail parties and get a patron and get galleries, and I had no interest in art on that level. I'd much rather be published.
That makes sense, but I think maybe there's a connection now that you just brought up to one of the essays in the book by the curator Robert Storer, who curated a show of your mouse work at the MoMA in the early 90s. And I was wondering if you could say something about what a big deal that show was, showing your work at the MoMA in the 90s, kind of a terrain-shifting moment.
Amazing that it happened at all. I'd already made an arrangement with the gallery through one of the raw artists named Suko, who wanted to show some of the mouse work. But then the MoMA came along through Rob Storr and offered to show it up in the museum. And what I was really impressed with was, as a curator, he had more hurdles to jump over than I could have ever imagined. Like, for one thing, he was afraid that somebody who was doing a drawing show for that year would take one drawing from Mouse, and then it would make of drawings that had happened in the recent past, and that would have tanked the exhibit that he wanted to put up. Another thing was, they were showing Yiddish films in the film part of the museum, and there were other curators saying, "This isn't the Jewish museum, Rob." So that was another way it could have gotten tanked. And there were a couple of other, they'd just done the high-low show. It hadn't gone over that well. In fact, I was one of the people poo-pooing it.
You wrote a great piece about it in Art Forum called High Art Lowdown.
Yeah, there was a single-page comics format review of the show and what my problems were with it. So I didn't think that that was going to be so good, because Rob Storr's boss, Kurt Varnado, the head curator, could have just said, "Oh man, we're staying away from that. We laid an egg. There's no reason to go back there." So all of those things he managed to elude and put together a very sophisticated show. And he showed me something that really was useful to me in the years that came after, because I knew I wanted people to see my rough sketches. Not like this one, but little color plan drawings. Because basically I drew the book the same size you're reading it, so they were very tiny boxes. I didn't want to have the embellishments and flourishes that could come with drawing big and reducing it down. I worked on typing paper with a fountain pen, so that the mark I made is the mark you saw, and it wouldn't get smoothed over, so it would be more like reading over my shoulder, and that was part of the point. And to accomplish this drawing style that I'd eventually figured out was going to be right for Mouse involved making something that was between handwriting and typography. Those were the two things I wanted simultaneously, and squaring that circle was complicated. But that's what I was after. And in order to do that, I had to do each of these tiny panels over and over again to get all of the details I wanted, but not so much detail that it would drown, so it would be legible handwriting. And if the book had been another 40 pages longer, I would have had to start drawing smaller than original size, because after 13 years, I got really good at making panels that were 1.5 or 2 inches high. But those rough sketches were worth seeing, and Rob embraced that idea and made the show really a show about the process. And that was really worthy because, you know, we went to a show that was quite nice in your town, in Cambridge. There was a show of Weirdo and Raw and the post-underground new wave comics of that period. And the problem is, it's easier to look at paintings in a museum than it is to look at comics. One cartoonist did point out, you put it on a wall, they'll look, whatever it is. And that's certainly true with a lot. That's certainly true. But it's a little harder to look at comics without also reading them.
Right.
And so...
Is that your phone?
I don't think I'll take the call.
Yeah. Can you ignore?
One of the cartoonists who was in that show in Boston. But in any case, I just wanted to find out what this thing could be. And when it was on walls, it usually, especially with cartoonists who are really good, like, I'm sorry to keep evoking Crumb, but I'm not sorry, he's certainly earned it. Crumb had a big show of his Genesis work, the telling of the Old Testament, panel by panel by panel by panel, with a lot of scholarship doing it. A panel for each begat, even. But that turned into somewhere between 200 and 300 pages. And when it was shown in a museum, you basically start walking through this labyrinth to see the book in page order. And he threw out all his rough sketches, for example. So it was just that book. And after about 4 or 5 pages, you go, wow, this guy really draws well. And he doesn't seem...
Can you turn it off?
Sorry. Maybe I could learn to turn off this thing. Maybe not. Yeah, I could. All right. So, what was I saying? Do you have any idea?
Yes. You were talking about the R. Crumb Genesis
Oh, yeah.
show.
So the thing is, after you get to see how consummate he is as a graphic artist, because he really is one of the greats of our age, how much pen control he has. There's almost no whiteout. There's some very minor scratchings of a line to shave it off. My artwork is just filled with paste-ups and with, even not in Mao's, but in other works that I've done, white out. So it's very physically present as inept, you know. And in modern art, it's good to be inept. It's preferred. If you're consummate, it looks like it's 19th century. So the result is that most comic shows stop being interesting after a certain number of pages because you get it, and then you might as well go home and read Genesis.
Right.
I mean, it's a book.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So shifting gears, I'm going to put this slide up. So Mouse has been subject to book banning in the past year in Tennessee and recently in Missouri. This is a page that the school board in Tennessee and McMinn County seemed to single out. What's your reaction to why Mouse is being banned?
You know, I'm even changing my mind now as I see that we are living through a Kanye West, Dave Chappelle, Trumpian moment. And I don't think that they were being especially anti-Semitic. Like, I learned about this late at night when the minutes of the meeting were released right before Holocaust Remembrance Day. So everybody was positive that this was done to specifically spit in everybody's eye. They're just really fucking stupid. They'd waited...
To put it one way.
They'd put 2 weeks between the time they had the minutes and putting them out, not thinking there was anything to be embarrassed about. Because as one of the people at the meeting who's a teacher said, don't get me wrong, I love the Holocaust. I just don't want it taught. I don't want to teach this book to my students. And then it led to this kind of tailspin, because the event that I attended, where I was finding out more about this in McMinn County by having a webinar, was subsidized by a Jewish organization, I think Baptist or something, Christian organization and a secular leftist organization, and it ended up reaching 17,000 people across the planet, so I don't know how many McMinn County people were there. But in any case, it was clear that what they were trying to do was not exactly necessarily just to diss Jews. It had another agenda. The agenda had to do with school boards. First of all, they're authoritarians. That's why they're on a school board. And they don't like anybody who disses authority. That was an important part of this. The other thing is they're all more or less, they think of themselves as righteous Christians. They don't want Junior exposed to terrible images of sexuality. Nobody was supposed to talk about this. When I read the minutes, it almost got blurted out because the agenda was different. The agenda was specifically to deal with, well, we're going to talk about the dirty words in Mouse. And the dirty words were like goddamn,
and
bitch, and maybe a couple of others that I didn't find, and the fact that there was female nudity. And it took me a while to find that because at first, like when I seen the articles the next day, they talked about, they're just nude mice. And I'm
yeah,
going,
that was wrong.
but that wasn't the case.
That was
what it
wrong.
really was something worse, which was in that 4-page Prisoner on the Hell Planet strip, there's me just bearing the weight of just having found out that my mother had killed herself, and there's a little kind of very small panel with a pileup of thoughts that included me remembering her reading to me, going, Mommy, another panel thinking postmenopausal depression, a small picture of her slashing her wrists, and a small picture of her in a bathtub where she had killed herself, reprising a panel slightly larger with the same thing. Anything that could have any kind of sexual connotation there totally passed me by. It's just most people, if they kill themselves in a bathtub, they tend to take their clothes off unless they're also demented. And at that point, somehow, either they thought that was hot and sexy, in which case I'll never go to McMinn County, but I think they were just looking for ways they could get that book in trouble and get it out of their lives. And that meant, look, there's a naked breast. It's a little black dot of ink there, seen from over her shoulder. That's enough for the book not to be here because Junior could see that, the 12-year-old Junior who's never had an iPhone in his hand but knows how to use it better than I do. So this was all because there's only a certain number of ways you can, there's no accurate Supreme Court decision that lets you say, we're going to protect Junior. And so there is a general idea that the Supreme Court ruled on that said, even sexual material can be used if it has redeeming social or artistic value. And there's things that have to do with community standards, but that's very vague. This is all based on an 80s law where a student in high school specifically was upset about books getting banned in his high school and got it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was a split decision that basically said, well, there is a right of some kind to protect children from things that are inappropriate for them, but it also has to be dealt with in terms of what's redeeming social value and so on. And as a result, the easiest way to get a book out of the school is to talk about sexual content and bad language. So they weren't trying to talk at all about this hanged mice, except it disturbed one of the members on the school board. He said, there's hanged mice in here and people bashing a kid against a wall and killing him against the wall, you know. And there shouldn't be pictures like that. So
yeah,
they were
said,
going
we don't
for
want to
that.
promote that kind of stuff.
We don't want to promote,
as
thank
if it's
you.
a promotion
That was the phrase.
of this.
So I wasn't exactly promoting it, but I was trying to explain it, what happened to my parents and what they did see and what they were involved with in a nuanced way. And they leaned on that because that was the easiest way to get it out. Because their real agenda, their basic agenda, it may include eventually anti-Semitic thoughts, but it wasn't at the forefront of their brain. It was about getting money out of the public schools into charter and private schools so you could teach religious education to your young and create suspicion of public institutions like libraries and schools. So it's, to me, as creepy as it could be.
Well, I wish you and I weren't ending on that note, but we have time for questions from the audience. So this is just the type of thing where you need to stand up and wave so I can see you or vocalize. Yes?
So I know it can be very overwhelming to interview a Holocaust survivor or any survivor of war. It can also be very difficult to interview parents. How did you start that? Like, it's just such an overwhelming task. Like, where did you start? Did you start from?
Well, you know, I started as I did. Did you hear the question?
Would you mind repeating it?
The question was like, it's very hard to talk to a Holocaust survivor, let alone your parents, and find out that story, and how did you approach it? Well, basically, a lot of it just started the way it started in the book. Tell me about Mom, you know? But I knew I was going there to interview him about this, that three-page mouse was the basis of what I wanted to make a much more expanded work. For me, it was all of that other stuff that was about time and space that was in breakdowns. I now was trying to spin in reverse to tell a complex narrative that wouldn't be standard for comics. And that meant trying to do a deep dive into his things. What was amazing to me is when I was a kid, he would just like brush it off, just saying like, oh, you don't want to hear such stories. And I'd say I did, but he wouldn't want to talk about it. He would wake up screaming at night, though, so I knew something was up. And then my mother would tell me stories, but without any context at all. It was just nuts. I almost regret I didn't find a way to put that in the book. It just never quite fit. But like, when I'm about the same age as the summer camp, 10, 11 or so, as that photograph, we're going to a supermarket together that's about 6 blocks from that little house.
Art, can you speak up? I'm having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry, are we having trouble with sound again?
Or I was, at least.
I'll talk to you then, okay.
Loudly project.
All right, so my mother wants to go to the supermarket and get some groceries, and she's taking me with her because it's not a school day or something. And we're about 2 blocks or 3 blocks from the house, aiming at the market. And then she says, I'm going to have to go to the bathroom. And then she has to decide whether to try to get the other 3 blocks or go back 1 or 2 blocks. So she turns around, and in order to distract herself, she's telling me what, when I was in the camps, out of nowhere, when I was in the camps, you couldn't pee whenever you needed to pee. You could only pee when they told you could piss. And when we were working in the fields, you could get killed for being seen relieving yourself. So what we did was the friends of mine stood around me in a circle so they couldn't see that I was squatting in the middle and pissing. That was heavy for a 10-year-old. I didn't, I knew you weren't supposed to piss without a toilet to piss in, but I didn't know that it was that fraught. And so there were little stories like that one that were outsized. And I never got to hear the rest of her stories for the most part. But when I went back to talk to my father as an adult, it's like, again, we had been sort of estranged. I didn't spend much time with him. But what I found was that when I went back and said, I'd like to hear more, because when I showed him the 3-page strip in progress, he gave me some information that had to do with the person who was downstairs in the bunker that heard them in the attic and turned them in to the Nazis when they were in a bunker in a ghetto. Says, but I buried that guy. And evidently, instead of it leading to good things for him, he was killed by either the Jewish police or the Nazis directly, and he was on the burial detail, my father. So that opened up a lot of story, and I knew that was something to go back to. So to my great surprise, when I asked him as an adult, it was nothing like, oh, it's so painful. It was like, why didn't you ask earlier? Like schmuck. So he just was wildly into it, and we just made it part of every visit. And it went on from that point, which must have been 76 or so, 78, I think, of going out fairly regularly to see him, always with a tape recorder. And when we'd finish, I'd just start again, because he had his stories, as did all of the survivor friends of his, and they would talk about it among themselves. And I learned enough passive Polish to sort of understand some of these stories, and I'd ask questions based on that. But the thing about all storytelling, not just my father's, is once you tell a story, it becomes a story. It's not your memory anymore. It's got a shape, and it gets streamlined. And the next time you tell it, it's even more streamlined, and finally it becomes almost mythological. So to get him out of those things, I would hit the same stories from different angles, like try to find out what was happening behind him, who was next to him, things that might open up that anecdote. And because we talked from 78 to 80-something, I guess he died in 82 or 83, after getting the stories, I would go back and get them again, pieces of them, to get a more fleshed out version and hear different variants on that story. But it never was anything but like what Hillary said it was before, of like a kind of safety zone for us. It's where our relationship took place.
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know, when you were planning the structure for the pages, did you have it sort of written out, or was there sort of a more ad hoc kind of approach?
Well, I'd start with written out, and then I would turn it into ad hoc after it was written. So I'd done an overall prose version of what I thought I was doing, but I didn't have the ending, but I knew what kind of thing was going to happen in it. And then I began to break it down into sections and chapters, and I began to take, how can these pages function as pages? And I would do one complete chapter, then go away from it for a little while and get my brains back and continue. We were doing Raw magazine at the time. After I found out we weren't just doing one issue of Raw, which I thought was a one-shot, my wife explained to me, no, we're doing this regularly. And then I realized I'd have to work on Maus as part of Raw or never get it done. The first issue had some other piece I'd been working on. And so I said, okay, we'll do it as long as it's a biannual. Because she's French and because I'm only semi-literate, I didn't know if biannual meant twice a year or once every 2 years. So I figured I could always get a chapter of Maus done if I just had that slack. And that's how we produced Maus and Maus in Raw as our self-published version of it. But when I was working on pages, I made a little grid for myself that was with even-sized boxes divided into sixths, like 2, 2, 2, and another one superimposed on it that was divided into fourths with 3, 3, 3. And that way I could find a lot of different box combinations that weren't as rigid as the way Dick Tracy, when it was reprinted in comic books, all the panels were the same size, and take advantage of the different vistas and scopes that panels could offer, but still have a structure that somehow was underneath it all. And my approach to a page was, by then I was thinking each page is a paragraph. It's got a beginning, middle, and end as a thought. This is very different than this is Harvey Kurtzman's philosophy, the guy who did Mad Comics and Two-Fisted Tales and really good anti-war Korean War comics and so on. Every page was a thought divided into 3 tiers. But that's very different from, say, the way Hergé did it, the guy who did Tintin. He always wanted to end with a question mark and 3 dots. What the heck? So you'd immediately glide into the story and couldn't put it down because you're never at a place that wasn't breathless. I wanted everything to have more of a metronome to it, in general, because I could understand a page better than a river. So I'd use that structure to see how much could fit in it. Sometimes what I thought would be 1 page would turn into 2 pages. I'd have to subdivide it into paragraph part A and paragraph part B, but always trying to make complete thoughts in a short unit, just so I could understand what I was doing. But I did end up having to make a lot, especially near the beginning, a lot of false starts and go back and start it again. And things had a lot more narration in it in the beginning. For a while, it was even like handwritten prose with a few boxes on a page that would eventually turn into comics. It was like uncharted territory. I understand that the word graphic story and even graphic novel did exist in the 60s, and I liked that fanzine that was called Graphic Story Magazine that defined a comic that was ambitious and wasn't necessarily comic. That was in my head, and it was in Will Eisner's head, who in '78 put out a book of short stories, and he called it a graphic novel. I just didn't like that phrase for what I was doing. I liked comics. My comic book, Maus, was a comics of words and pictures. It was inspired by one of the essays where I got annoyed at somebody who was really bright, Adam Gopnik, was talking about the roots of my work and was finding it an Italian caricature of the 18th and 17th centuries, as well as making a really smart observation that my mouse heads were a little bit like the bird head Haggadah. But when he's giving me this pedigree, I was aware of caricature from the 1700s, and I liked Daumier's work well enough. But it wasn't at the front of my mind. Little Orphan Annie was there, Mad was there, those war comics I just described were there. Even Dick Tracy was certainly there, the diagrammatic qualities. And there was a whole tradition I was working with. There was a late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century vocabulary that eventually was a fairly sophisticated syntax, because unlike movies that seem to be born within a 5-year period, all of a sudden D.W. Griffith comes along and they invent cross-cutting and close-ups and tracking shots. Comics were a much more start and stop, stuttering way of developing its own grammar. And that grammar was useful to me, so I had no pejorative with comics, except I didn't think they necessarily had to be funny. So I changed the word to C-O-M-I-X to comics, words and pictures, which had been used for underground comics with an X when I was in San Francisco. And that was an easier phrase for me to assimilate than graphic novels. But they were right, I was wrong. I mean, if we called them comics, they'd still think they were meant to be funny. And ultimately, they wouldn't have been able to make a literary case for it the way Hillary was able to. So,
We have
good
time
marketing.
for one more question. Yes.
Happy holidays, Mr. Spiegelman.
What holiday?
The holiday season.
December.
Oh,
it's
that
December
one.
1st.
Oh, all right.
I'm being generalized.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Since Mouse is approaching its 45th anniversary,
Oh, Jesus.
I'm kind of curious, how has your thoughts and opinions maybe have shifted, changed, or evolved in certain ways on such a significant work of yours in comparison to when it was first released back in 1978?
Okay, so I think looping back to the question you were asking at the very beginning,
Yeah.
and it's a good one. Look, I didn't have any great expectations. I would, while I was in the middle of this endless project, think, oh, and then someday I'll be on Johnny Carson's show and he'll be interviewing me about Mao's and saying, in that panel, why did you do it? That was just ridiculous thoughts that would go through one's head. But I really did believe that we would publish it ourselves. We had published Raw Magazine ourselves. And it was only sort of by accident that it got pulled above ground, because we had Raw Magazine. An agent from a very kind of raffish, low end of the book industry, who was mainly making his money, Scott Meredith, by convincing people that he could critique their book if they sent it to an agency with a fee and make it more sellable. So that was just a scam of a certain kind. So that agency had one guy who was a foreign rights guy, and he ends up calling me up out of the blue and says, I hear you do a magazine called Raw. I said, yeah, we do that. Well, could you send me a couple of copies? There's a Greek publisher who's interested in reprinting it in Greek. So that was interesting. I sent him a few copies. So then he got back a week or so later and said, well, never mind, there's another Raw magazine that's a skin magazine that they wanted to reprint. So that was that, but he said, but you have this booklet that's been running here called Maus, or whatever way he pronounced it. Is that going to be a book? I said, well, I hope so if I get it done. And he said, could I represent it? And I said, I guess. So he was taking it around to publishers, and Scott, he was just a foreign rights guy, and he wanted to graduate into being an agent. Scott Meredith, the agent of Scott Meredith Agency, just said, if you sell that, I'll eat my hat, you know. And he basically was on safe ground because my agent was not a very good agent, didn't know the right people, sent it out everywhere. So it went to like 20, 30 more publishers, and just got rejection slip after rejection slip. So I was back to thinking, okay, you know, they saw it, and it wasn't for them. But it made the rounds. And in fact, in MetaMouse, the book that we worked on, a lot of the, I have terrible files, but I did find at least 20 rejection slips that are, you don't have that.
No, I
do
don't
you?
have the rejection slip.
But people like that part of the book a lot, because when a book succeeds against all odds, it's always a nice story. But basically, I thought we would publish it ourselves. And I wanted something very specific. I didn't want it to be published by a comics publisher, because as it went along, a really good comics publisher in France called Futuropolis really wanted to do the book when it was all done. But I didn't like the formats they would do it in. I wanted something that looked like the size of this book, a real book, with French flaps to make it have a bookmark, because I thought that was part of what a book should be. And I was envisioning that, and nobody really wanted to even get as far as to talk about what kind of paper we would use, what size. So I thought we would do it in whichever way we wanted to do it. We would just make an edition. Then, because I was doing illustrations for the Times, a friend of mine who's an art director there at a party was with his wife, who was the art director at Pantheon of the book jackets, similar to the job that Chip Kidd has there now, if you follow that corner of the world. And I just mentioned all these rejection slips I'd gotten for this thing, and Louise Feely, that art director, says, "So did you ever show it to Pantheon?" I said, "I don't know, I'll look." And so I got in touch with them. They say, "Yep, it's over here. It's just not suitable for us or something." So, "Do you mind if I bring it back and show it to somebody there?" So she brought it to Andre Schifrin. And that was great, because what I found out later, and she will
Who was
deny...
the head of Pantheon?
He's the head of Pantheon, but it went to some other editors up there. And although she will deny it to her dying day, a woman named Sarah Burstel, who's a very good editor at this point, was horrified by this book when it came up there. Her mother was a survivor who played cards with my stepmother in the Catskills, and this book was not going to find an easy reception coming out of the blue from a rebellious child of a survivor. And so the book just, she says that she was in favor of publishing the book, but I heard it from too many people up there that that wasn't the case. Nevertheless, when it went back to Andre Schifrin, he looked at it and said, "Yeah, that's kind of interesting. Well, we do lots of books that don't make any money. We could do one more." And he said, "I just have to find an editor who would be interested." And he found an editor up there named Tom Engelhart, to give credit where it's due, whose mother had been a cartoonist for the New York Post when it was a left-wing paper. And his background in cartoons at least made it possible for Pantheon, that did nothing with cartoons, to become the shepherd for this book. And then the thing that really changed it was that essay that Hillary was referring to by...
Which is in this book by Ken Tucker, which is
yeah,
in the
Ken
New York
Tucker
Times
wrote this
book
unheard
review.
of essay while it was being published in a small press magazine, a small press underground comics magazine. It was a work in progress. And so all of a sudden there's this essay about it free-floating in the Times Book Review, when that was really meaningful. You know, like that was the capital of what books would get seen in the world. And it talked about it as a work in progress, a work of postmodernism that had an ethical core or something. I like that phrase, because I didn't know the phrase postmodernism, but I understood the word ethical core. So I thought that was cool. And all of a sudden, I was only in the midpoint of Maus. I just finished what became the first volume, was working on the first part of the second volume, and all of a sudden Pantheon, who's announced in that essay as eventually we'll put it out as a book, is getting inundated with letters saying, "We want this book, where is it?" And that was astonishing. It was just you know, in the world of multiverses, I think there's only one world in which we have Trump, COVID, and Maus being banned in a school in Tennessee, and a million others that are far saner. Similarly, there's only one or two where the book got published because of Andre Schifrin and because of an essay that appeared in the New York Times Book Review, and then literally became a big success.
Well, we're out of time, so that's a nice moment to end on.